You don't have to stay, you know." "I know." "Then why are you still here? Everyone else left the moment the money stopped being convenient." "I'm not here for the money." "Then what are you here for?" I didn't answer right away. Out past the terrace, the Atlantic was doing what it always did at that hour, dragging itself against the rocks like it had somewhere else to be and couldn't quite get there. The wind had picked up. I remember being cold and not caring. "I'm here," I finally said, "because you're the only person in this house who's ever asked me how I was doing and actually waited to hear the answer." She didn't say anything back. She just looked at me the way she sometimes did when she thought I wasn't watching, like she was trying to memorize something before it had the chance to leave. "My name is Nora Bennett. 3 months before that night on the terrace, I didn't know this woman existed. I want to tell you how we got there, because it didn't happen the way you'd think. There was no lightning, no single moment where the world tilted. It happened slowly, the way a tide comes in. So gradual you don't notice the water is at your ankles until it's at your waist, and by then it's too late to pretend you're still standing on dry land. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description." I was 29 years old and broke in the specific, exhausting way that comes from being the only person in your family with a steady paycheck. My mother had been sick for 2 years. Nothing that was going to kill her, the doctors kept saying, but nothing that was going to let her work again either. I covered her medication. I covered the gap her insurance left open like a wound that never quite closed. I was good at my job, which was the only thing keeping all of it from collapsing, and my job was cataloging dead people's handwriting for a living. That's how I ended up at Callaway House. It sat on 11 acres of Newport coastline, the kind of property that made you lower your voice without meaning to. White stone gone soft gray at the edges, ivy that had clearly been allowed to do whatever it wanted for the better part of a century. I'd been hired through an archival firm to sort through 3 generations of Callaway correspondence. Letters, ledgers, a library that hadn't been properly organized since before the woman who built it died. My job was to make sense of paper. I was not hired to make sense of the woman who lived there now, though I suppose in the end, that's exactly what happened. Eleanor Callaway was 41. She had inherited the house, the foundation, the name, and, depending on who in the family you asked, either a fortune or a burden, the year her grandmother died and left everything to her, instead of to anyone with the last name still attached to a husband. I learned this in pieces, the way you learn most things about wealthy families. Not from them, but from the people circling them. There was her cousin Priya, who visited twice in my first month, and managed both times to mention the foundation's board seats within 10 minutes of walking in the door. There was Diane Okafor, who'd managed Callaway Investments since Eleanor's grandmother's time, and who looked at me, the first week, like I was the expense she hadn't approved. There was an aunt who called on Sundays, and somehow always needed something. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of Eleanor Callaway. Almost no one seemed to want Eleanor. I noticed that before I noticed anything else about her. She would sit at the head of a table full of people discussing her own money, and she would go somewhere else entirely behind her eyes. And nobody at that table seemed to clock that she'd left the room without standing up. I clocked it. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew what it looked like to disappear in plain sight. I'd been doing it myself for 2 years, smiling at co-workers while running numbers in my head about my mother's prescriptions. The first real conversation we had wasn't really a conversation. I was 3 weeks into the project, knee-deep in a box of letters from the 1950s, and she came into the library at 10 at night in sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, looking nothing like the woman who'd sat at the head of that table. "You're still here," she said, surprised. "There's a system to it," I said, gesturing at the boxes. "If I stop now, I'll lose the thread." She sat down across from me without being invited, picked up one of the letters I'd already sorted, and read it without asking permission. I should have minded. I didn't. "My grandmother wrote this to her sister," she said after a minute. They didn't speak for the last 6 years of her life. Nobody ever told me why. Do you want to know? She looked up at me like the question itself was strange. Like nobody had asked her what she wanted in a long time. Only what she was owed or what was owed of her. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe. We sat in that library until 2 a.m, going through the box together, and she laughed twice. Real laughs, surprised out of her, not the practice sound she used at the head of the table. And I went home that night and lay awake longer than I should have, turning the sound of that laugh over like a coin I didn't remember picking up. That was who we were, in the beginning. A woman cataloging somebody else's family, and a woman who felt like a stranger in her own. I told myself it was nothing for a long time. That's the first thing you should know about how this kind of thing happens. It doesn't arrive announcing itself. It arrives disguised as something reasonable. She's just lonely. I'm just convenient. She likes having someone in the house who isn't circling. I held on to that explanation the way you hold onto a railing on a staircase you don't trust. But the house started rearranging itself around the time we spent together, and I noticed it the way you notice a clock that's been moved 3 inches to the left. You can't say exactly what's different, only that something is. She started coming to the library earlier. Not at 10 at night anymore, but at 6, while I was still drinking the coffee I'd brought from the kitchen, and she'd bring 2 cups instead of 1 without ever asking how I took mine, because at some point, I don't know when, she'd started paying attention. You drink it black until 11, she told me once, sliding a mug across the table, and then you cave and put cream in it like you're embarrassed about it. I'm not embarrassed. You hide the carton behind the kettle. I hadn't realized anyone had noticed that. I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Something warm and a little bit alarming, like standing too close to a fire you'd been told was decorative. The letters became a kind of language between us. I'd find something. A line from a love letter her great-aunt had written to a woman named Josephine in 1938. A recipe scrawled in the margin of a 1962 grocery list. A photograph of 2 women standing closer together than the caption ever explained. And I'd hold it up, and she'd come stand beside me to read it, close enough that I could smell the soap she used, something like cedar and rain, close enough that the heat of her arm against mine became a fact I had to actively not think about. I started noticing things about myself that I didn't like noticing. I started choosing what to wear to the house. I told myself it was professionalism. I knew, somewhere under the part of me that was still arguing, that it wasn't. There was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Diane Okafor had been there that morning, going over quarterly numbers with the particular brand of patience people use with someone they don't trust. And after Diane left, Eleanor came and found me in the library and sat down across the table and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. She thinks you're after something, Eleanor finally said. I know. Are you? I should have been angry. I wasn't. I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand before, how exhausting it must be to never be sure why anyone stayed. I'm after the part of this job where I get to leave at the end of the day and not think about money for one evening, I said. And lately I haven't been very good at that second part. She looked at me for a long moment. Why not? I didn't answer that one. I picked up the next letter in the box instead, and my hands weren't quite steady, and if she noticed, and I think she did, because she noticed everything, she had the grace not to say so. That night, driving home, I caught myself smiling at a red light, for no reason I could explain to myself, and the thought arrived before I could stop it. I look forward to seeing her more than I look forward to anything else in my life right now. I pushed the thought down. It came back up anyway, the way things in water do. The thing that broke the spell of pretending happened on a Thursday in October, in the kitchen, of all places. Not the library, not the terrace, just the kitchen, with rain coming down sideways against the windows, and the 2 of us eating soup standing up, because neither of us had bothered to sit down at the table. Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone in this house? She asked. Always. I was engaged once, before all this. She gestured vaguely at the room, at the house, at the weight of the name she carried. Her name was Sloane. We were together 4 years. My grandmother found out 3 months before the wedding and told me very calmly over tea that if I went through with it, the foundation would pass to my cousin instead. Not because she disapproved of Sloane specifically, because she decided, a long time before I was born, that the Calloway name couldn't carry that kind of story publicly. Not back then. What did you do? I let Sloane go. Her voice didn't shake, which somehow made it worse. I told myself it was for the foundation, for the work it does, for all the people it helps. And maybe that was even partly true. But it was also the easier thing. Loving her was going to cost me everything I'd been told mattered, and I wasn't brave enough to find out if it was worth it. The rain kept going. I didn't say anything for a long time, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that she wasn't just telling me a story about her past. She was telling me what it cost to choose safety over the truth, and she was telling me because some part of her wanted me to understand exactly what I'd be walking into if I ever let myself feel what I was already feeling. Do you regret it? I asked. Every day for 15 years, she said. I built a whole life around not feeling things too loudly. I got very good at it, and then you showed up with a box of my grandmother's letters and started asking questions nobody had asked me in a decade, and I realized how loud the quiet had gotten. I should have said something. I had something to say. It was sitting right there, behind my teeth, and I swallowed it instead, because I was scared, and because 3 days later, Priya called a family meeting that I wasn't invited to but heard about anyway, through Diane, who told me with a flat, deliberate kind of warning in her voice. They're talking about whether you should still have access to the house unsupervised, Diane said. Priya's saying you've gotten close to Eleanor in a way that isn't appropriate for staff. I'd be careful if I were you. Families like this one protect themselves first. I went home that night and didn't sleep. I thought about my mother's medication. I thought about the steady paycheck that had kept us afloat for 2 years. I thought about how easy it would be to pull back, to become professional again, to let the warmth between us cool into something safer for both of us. So I tried. I started leaving earlier. I stopped bringing my own coffee mug, the one she'd started filling without asking. I gave clipped, efficient answers when she tried to draw me into conversation, and I told myself I was protecting my job, protecting her reputation, protecting both of us from a mess neither of us could afford. It didn't work the way I thought it would. The distance didn't feel like relief. It felt like holding my breath underwater, telling myself I could keep doing it indefinitely, while every part of my body screamed that I couldn't. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. Did I do something? She asked, the 4th day of my retreat, standing in the library doorway with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not anger. Something closer to fear. No, I said. I just think I've been too involved in things that aren't really my place. Something closed in her face when I said that. Not dramatically. Just a door, quietly shutting. Right, she said, of course. She left the library, and I sat there with a box of letters I couldn't focus on, and I understood with my whole chest that I had just done to her exactly what everyone else in her life had always done. Made her feel like the connection between us had a price, and I'd decided it wasn't worth paying. That was the night I went home and finally let myself say the sentence I'd been avoiding for 2 months. I am in love with her, and I have been for weeks, and pretending otherwise hasn't protected either one of us. It's only made both of us smaller. Before I keep going, if you've made it this far, it's probably because some part of this story is touching something you already know. That feeling of being wanted for what you can offer instead of who you actually are. Or worse, the fear of loving someone and pulling away from them to protect yourself first. So go ahead and hit like on this video right now. It genuinely helps me keep bringing stories like this one to you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that too, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment when you pulled away from someone you cared about because being close to them felt like too much of a risk? I read every single comment. And tell me where you're watching from tonight. I'll send a heart to every city. Okay, back to the story. The family meeting Priya had been threatening finally happened on a Saturday morning, and this time I was invited. Summoned might be the more honest word, because, as Diane put it on the phone the night before, they want to ask you some questions directly. I sat at the long table in the formal dining room, the one I'd never once seen used for an actual meal, across from Priya and two board members I'd never met, and Diane, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Eleanor sat at the head, the way she always did, but for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't disappear behind her own eyes. She watched the room like she was waiting to see what it would do. "We have concerns," Priya began, "about the nature of your relationship with my cousin. Concerns about whether someone in your position, paid, temporary, with no prior ties to this family, should have the kind of access and influence you've developed in 3 months. Ask me what you actually want to ask," I said. I surprised myself with how steady my voice came out. Priya's mouth tightened. "Are you in a romantic relationship with Eleanor?" The room went very quiet. I felt Eleanor go still beside me, and I understood, in that silence, that everyone at that table was waiting to watch me do the thing that was easiest. Deny it, smooth it over, protect my paycheck, protect the version of myself that didn't cause trouble. I thought about my mother. I thought about the steady money I needed, and the cousin who'd never once, in 15 years, asked Eleanor what she wanted instead of what she was worth. I thought about the 4 days I'd spent pulling away from the only person who'd ever asked how I was really doing, and how much worse that distance had felt than any risk I was about to take. "I have feelings for her," I said. "I haven't acted on them. I've actually spent the last week trying very hard to bury them, because I was afraid of exactly this conversation. But I'm not going to sit here and lie about it to make this room more comfortable." "Then you understand," Priya said, "that your position here is no longer appropriate. I understand that you've spent 15 years circling this family's money and calling it concern," I said, "and I'm done pretending that's the same thing as caring about her." I heard Eleanor exhale, very quietly beside me. "Nora," Diane said, a warning. "No," Eleanor said, and it was the first thing she'd said since the meeting started, and her voice cut through the room cleanly. "Let her finish." I looked at Eleanor, and something in her face, open, frightened, hopeful in a way I'd never let myself fully see before, made the rest of what I needed to say arrive without effort. "I came here to catalog letters," I said. "I didn't come here looking for any of this. But I'm not going to walk out of this room and pretend I don't feel what I feel, just because it's inconvenient for the rest of you. I'd rather lose this job than lose the only honest thing that's happened to me in years." I did lose the job. Not officially. Eleanor wouldn't allow that. Told the board flatly that any attempt to remove me from the house would be the last conversation she ever had with most of the people sitting at that table. But I resigned anyway, 2 weeks later, because staying on the family payroll while loving the woman who signed those checks felt like exactly the kind of complication neither of us needed. It cost something real. My mother cried on the phone when I told her I was leaving a steady paycheck for uncertainty, and it took 3 long conversations before she understood I wasn't being reckless, I was being honest. Maybe for the first time in years. Priya stopped speaking to me entirely. Diane took longer to come around, though she did, eventually, in her own careful way, sending a short email months later that just said, "I was wrong about you. I'm glad she has you, but I also got something I hadn't had in longer than I could remember." 3 weeks after I resigned, Eleanor found me on the terrace again, the same terrace from the night this story started. Except this time there was no question hanging unanswered between us. No version of myself I was hiding. I keep thinking about what you said in that meeting, she told me. That you'd rather lose the job than lose the honest thing. I meant it. I've spent 15 years choosing the safe thing, she said. I watched my grandmother teach me that love was negotiable if the cost was high enough. I almost did it again with you. Almost let you walk away that week you pulled back. Because some old, exhausted part of me thought that's just what happens. That people leave once the cost becomes visible. I'm not leaving, I said. I know that now. She reached over and took my hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady, like she'd been planning the motion for a long time and had finally decided to trust it. Her palm was warm against the cold of the evening, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsteady for months. I just needed to hear you say it without anyone in the room threatening to take something from you for saying it. I'm saying it now, I said, with nothing left to lose, which turns out to make it a lot easier. She laughed. That real laugh, the one I'd fallen for in a library at 10 o'clock at night 3 months earlier. And for the first time since I'd met her, I watched Eleanor Calloway look like a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I finally had the thing I'd spent 2 months trying not to want. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't certain. My mother still worries about money sometimes, and Priya still hasn't called. But it was mine. It was honest. It was whole. And I've learned that the bravest thing you can do isn't avoiding the risk. It's choosing the truth even when it costs you something real. If this story meant something to you, type courage in the comments. That's how I'll know you stayed with me until the end. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind that stay with you a little longer than they should, click the video on your screen right now. Sending you a big hug. See you in the next story. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description.